Do you remember walking into a Westfield back in the early 2000s, hearing that loud fluorescent hum and spotting the bold yellow and black sign of Dick Smith Electronics? Maybe you went in to grab a phone charger. Maybe you were killing time, or maybe you were just a kid being dragged around the shops, and Dick Smith was the one place that actually felt exciting. Either way, for a while there, it felt like Dick Smith was everywhere, and then, seemingly overnight, it vanished. It was like a light flicked off, and nobody said a word. So, what happened to Dick Smith? The man, the myth, the store. Why did this Aussie tech icon disappear so suddenly? Let's rewind all the way back to 1968. The Beatles are topping the charts, Australians are wrapping their heads around decimal currency, and a young guy named Dick Smith is running a side hustle out of his garage in Sydney. He's selling car radios, wiring kits, and random electronics to whoever's keen. It's small, scrappy, and super DIY. But Dick's got something that can't be bought: curiosity, guts, and timing. By 1973, he opened his first store in Artarmon. This store had things like CB radios, soldering irons, weird components you didn't know existed until you needed one. It was all there. And if you were the kind of person who liked tinkering, this place was paradise. As the 70s rolled into the 80s, Australians were getting more and more tech hungry. Home computers were emerging and electronics were finally accessible. Dick Smith Electronics rode that wave perfectly. But what really set it apart was a brand that didn't take itself too seriously. The catalogs were cheeky, the branding was bold, the ads had personality. It was educational but fun. If you were a tech-curious teenager, a weekend DIYer, or just someone who liked gadgets, you probably ended up inside a Dick Smith store more times than you can count. By the time the 90s and early 2000s rolled around, Dick Smith had grown into a full-on retail empire and had more than 300 stores across Australia and New Zealand. You could find them in nearly every major shopping centre. The store was practically part of the Aussie shopping DNA. You might have popped in to buy a battery, then walked out with some weird motion sensor toy you didn't know you needed. It was tech heaven, but with an Aussie flavour. And let's not forget those yellow plastic bags that were instantly recognisable. The brand had built something rare: trust, nostalgia, and nationwide familiarity. But behind all the fun and quirky product demos, big changes were brewing. Way back in 1982, Dick Smith sold the business to Woolworths for around $25 million. He stepped away from day-to-day operations, and for a while, things still looked okay. But slowly, the soul of the brand began to change. Woolworths wasn't exactly in the business of nerd culture. They weren't about resistors or capacitors or hands-on learning. They were about mass-market retail, efficiency, and returns. And so, Dick Smith Electronics started drifting away from its original identity. Less about DIY kits and more about consumer electronics. TVs, microwaves, GPS units, more JB Hi-Fi, less JCar. And for a time, that sort of worked. The stores still looked familiar, and Aussies still needed chargers and cables. But something was missing. By the early 2000s and 10s, the retail world had changed completely. Online shopping was booming. JB Hi-Fi was dominating the tech space, Officeworks was undercutting on price, and Amazon was lurking on the horizon. Dick Smith, now part of Woolworths' retail portfolio, was struggling to stay relevant. The company was no longer innovating, it was reacting. It didn't know who it was anymore. And worse, it wasn't exciting. So in 2012, Woolworths offloaded the whole thing to a private equity firm, Anchorage Capital Partners, for just $20 million. That's less than the value of the stock sitting in a few of their warehouses. But Anchorage didn't buy Dick Smith because they believed in the brand. They bought it to flip it. Within 12 months, they had taken the company public on the stock exchange with a shiny new valuation of over $500 million. They had pumped up the books by overvaluing inventory, packing stores with stock, and giving the appearance of a thriving business. But beneath the surface, it was a house of cards. The stock wasn't selling, profit margins were squeezed, and stores were underperforming. And no one, not the customers, the staff, the investors, really knew what Dick Smith stood for anymore. By late 2015, it was all starting to collapse. The share price plummeted. Investors panicked. And in January 2016, Dick Smith Electronics officially entered voluntary administration. Stores shut down almost overnight. Over 3,000 employees lost their jobs. Customers who had gift cards were left holding worthless plastic. It was one of the biggest retail collapses in Australian history, and it felt like it happened in the blink of an eye. Even Dick Smith, the real guy, was furious. He had nothing to do with the company for over 30 years, but his name was still on the door. He called the whole thing disgraceful and blamed the private equity vultures who gutted the company for a quick payday. After the collapse, the Dick Smith brand was sold again, this time to Kogan.com. They revived the name as an online-only store. But let's be honest, it's not the same. It's a logo slapped on a warehouse-to-door e-commerce model. No more brick-and-mortar stores, no more hands-on demo tables, no more "I'll just pop into Dick Smith and browse for fun." So, what actually killed Dick Smith Electronics? It was death by 1,000 bad decisions. First, it sold its soul. The brand went from enthusiast-focused to generic retail. It lost its core audience and tried to be all things to all people. Second, it was passed around like a hot potato, from Woolworths to private equity, each with less connection to the original mission. Third, the retail landscape changed, and Dick Smith didn't adapt fast enough. They weren't competitive on price, they didn't own their niche, and they never really embraced online properly until it was way too late. But maybe the real tragedy is that Australians love Dick Smith. It was our tech shop. It was part of childhoods, of projects with dad in the garage, of after-school adventures at the local shopping centre. It was where future engineers and hobbyists first fell in love with tech. And that kind of magic is hard to recapture. Dick Smith Electronics wasn't perfect, but it had character, it had charm, and in a world of faceless mega retailers, that counted for something. It gave people the confidence to ask dumb questions, the freedom to experiment, and the joy of building things with their own two hands. Today, when you walk past the empty space where a Dick Smith used to be, maybe replaced by a phone accessories kiosk or a bubble tea stall, it's hard not to feel a little pang of nostalgia. Because something that once felt big and important quietly faded away. So yeah, rest in peace, DSE. You were too nerdy, too quirky, and too Aussie for the corporate world to understand. But for those who grew up with you, you'll always be the place where their tech journey began. If you've got memories of Dick Smith, drop them in the comments below. What did you buy? What kit did you never quite finish? And if you enjoyed this story, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss out on more deep dives like this. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.